Good question from the chat. Yes, this is going to be recorded. We will go ahead and get started. Thank you all for joining today. My name is Peter Tite, and I am Quorum's stakeholder team lead on our customer success team. At Quorum, I'm responsible for helping clients use Quorum stakeholder engagement tools to map, track, change, and report on their landscape. And I'm so excited to be here to show you how you all can do the same. So first things first, today, I'm going to review why stakeholder mapping is so important. We're going to cover 5 different techniques that you can choose to organize your stakeholder mapping. We're going to walk through how to actually do some of that in Quorum, and then going to cover some best practices that we've developed for working with our clients here at Quorum. In the meantime, please feel free to submit your questions through the chat box. We should have plenty of time at the end of this call to answer any of those and get the conversation started. Now, moving into the content of our day, what is stakeholder mapping? Stakeholder mapping is a unified tracking system that collects and measures ongoing engagement with your stakeholders. This provides each individual on your team with the most up-to-date information on where each stakeholder stands on your issues and on your organization. Stakeholder mapping is a critical step in stakeholder engagement strategy that allows you to identify and track who your most important stakeholders are. Good stakeholder mapping sets your organization up for success in measuring the impact of your work at the end of the year. This works by mapping your stakeholders at the beginning of the year, reevaluating their placement on your stakeholder map throughout the year based on your interactions or your engagement with them, then evaluating your team's success at growing the strength of those relationships at the end of the year by comparing where a stakeholder started versus where they finished. So for example, how many detractors did we have at the beginning of the year, and how many of those folks were we able to move either to be neutral on our organization or actually be champions of ours? So I want to put a quick disclaimer to say that today we're going to be showing examples with US senators as your stakeholders, but these practices and best practices can be replicated at the state, local, or international policymaker level, or with non-governmental third-party stakeholders that you've added into your Quorum contacts data set. We're going to cover 5 stakeholder mapping techniques, including mapping by issue, team member relationship, interest and influence, tiers, and relationship sentiment. But if you've got other ideas and other ways that your organization is mapping your stakeholders, you should feel free to throw those in the chat, and we can try to talk about them at the end here. So one way to map stakeholders is by the issues that they work on or that you care about, using Quorum's issue management feature. By mapping stakeholders to issues, you can quickly answer the question, for example, what key stakeholders do we have on renewable energy? This way, if new legislation is introduced, you can quickly sort for the key stakeholders with whom you need to communicate and engage with on the issue of renewable energy. By tagging your stakeholders to issues, you can also target specific organization updates or communications or invites to events specific to those issue areas. This is going to allow you to both refine and specialize your communications with stakeholders based on the topics that are most important to them, and therefore they're going to be more likely to actually engage with your content, to open your emails, to attend your events. So I want to take us now to show an example of what a sheet of issues stakeholders might look like. In this case, you can see, again, we're looking at just members of the Senate here, but we've pulled in columns for different types of information from the system. So these columns are going to show you the number of meetings that your team has taken related to the issue of autonomous vehicles versus privacy versus STEM. And so if you're trying to figure out, where should, which officials are most important or which contacts are most important to a particular issue, you can build a sheet like this to evaluate and check your opinion. And for example, if we want to mark Tim Kaine and say that he should also be related to the issue of privacy, any of these blue columns in Quorum are going to be editable. So we can just quickly mark that he is related to data privacy issue, and that's going to live on his profile moving forward. Coming back to our presentation here is the ability to map by team member relationships. A lot of organizations choose to map their stakeholders by indicating who on their team is the primary relationship owner for that stakeholder. I can just say the vast majority of my clients decide to assign relationship holders to their stakeholders when they're targeting them. Some decide to do this in different ways. So some folks will say, take a divide and conquer approach where they say one team member owns relationships with Democrats and one owns relationships with Republicans, or a region-based approach. Or some clients will share the load and they'll have several team members that are assigned to own a given relationship. That's a helpful strategy as well. Either way, setting clear guidelines around which team members should own which relationships will help your organization promote accountability and organization ultimately. Additionally, Quorum recently rolled out a few features that are really cool that you can leverage once you have filled in this relationship information. So one is that you can now send emails out to a large group of stakeholders, whether they're contacts, officials, and staffers, and each individual recipient will be able to receive that email from the person on your team who owns their relationship. So this helps, prevent you needing to go draft 50 different versions of an email curated to each individual team member's list. Additionally, we also now allow team members to mark whether a contact is assigned to a particular stakeholder. So this is a sheet, and this is going to show you kind of what this looks like. But this column, these two columns here are going to be users that are assigned as well as contacts that are assigned. And a reason you might want to use the contact relationship assignment is if you're a trade association and you've uploaded contact information for the presidents or CEOs of your member companies, or if you're a nonprofit and you've entered in the contacts for your grass tops advocates, maybe you want to store in the system alongside who on your team owns that relationship, which member of your broader network is responsible for that relationship. And that can be really helpful information. If you're trying to assess who should be marked as the relationship owner, you can always pull in columns for the number of meetings that each individual on your team has had with that stakeholder and see, the person that is having this many meetings with Mary should probably be assigned to Mary. Awesome. Now, the third technique is something I want to spend a little more time on. So each of your stakeholders, no matter who they are, has a certain level of interest in an issue as well as a level of influence on that issue. With knowledge of this information, you can build a matrix mapping interest on one axis versus influence, which is going to provide you with kind of 4 different quadrants. Your communication strategy can be organized and prioritized based on those quadrants. So for example, you have high interest and high influence stakeholders. Those are the people that you maybe want to engage with first because they're the ones who can really help move the needle. Your second priority, though, should probably be those who have high influence but low interest. With these stakeholders, you can spend time communicating your message about the issues that impact your organization and share that information with them such that they'll be able to move the needle once they increase the level of interest in that issue. So depending on who your stakeholders are, there are a few different ways to determine their interest and influence. First, you can use a qualitative system based on your team's interactions or prior knowledge of those stakeholders. Or you can take a more quantitative approach using data points on their legislative activity, the dialogue that they are putting out on social media or in press releases, for example, to drive that interest as well. For example, your interest score could be the number of times they talk about an issue in documents such as social media or press releases or floor statements. And then the influence score could be the number of times that they've passed a bill out of committee on that particular topic. So I want to show you how this might look in Quorum's Sheets tool. Here's a sheet of officials again, and we've pulled in a few different columns. You can pull in as many of these columns as you'd like, but this is going to show us our, for example, our mentions of a series of search terms related to energy. So this is how frequently are they talking about energy issues and or solar issues. And then this column is going to be more of our influence column. And this is going to show us how frequently are they passing bills out of committee on that particular topic. So this is another way that you can leverage the data that your team is putting in on the legislative tracking front to enhance your stakeholder mapping, because the more bills that you tag to a particular issue, the better you're going to be able to understand whether a given legislator is actually effective at legislating on that issue. But if you're dealing with contacts, this can be different. So you could have the interest related to a outcome field that you add to your interactions with those contacts, and this can be kind of customized the way that you'd like it to. So the sky's the limit here, but happy to also answer any questions at the end that you might have. So with a tiered system, your organization should give every stakeholder a number, 1 to 3, with tier 1 stakeholders being your biggest champions and tier 3s are less influential stakeholders. You could use a subjective numbering system to determine which tier a stakeholder belongs to, or you could set up strict parameters as to what constitutes a tier 2 versus a tier 1 stakeholder, such as the number of events that they've attended or the number of meetings that you've had with them. That you're going to be able to measure how stakeholders move up the tiers as you track your organization's efforts to see what's effective at moving the needle with stakeholders to new tiers. Does a certain type of action make that stakeholder more likely to increase their involvement in your issues? So pulling up a tier sheet, there's a couple of different ways to do this. Some clients will choose to have a tier correspond with the importance of that legislator, or how driven they are by your cause. So this, I have one client that actually uses this column here for the number of interactions, or even has an interaction column that shows the number of days inactive, the number of days it's been since they logged an interaction, to show for our tier 1 stakeholders, our internal process is that every single tier 1 stakeholder, we meet with them every month. And every quarter, we meet with our tier 2 stakeholders, and every year we meet with our tier 3 stakeholders. And having this sort of guideline internal system tied to your stakeholder map and quorum is going to allow you to hold your team responsible to actually filling these fields out, but also, checking yourself and checking your assumptions. Maybe you thought someone was a tier 1, but they don't end up engaging with you on a monthly basis, and maybe they should be moved to a tier 2. So this is all going to help you kind of understand your stakeholder map a little bit better and visualize it in a sheet like this. Now, the final technique that I want to cover today is mapping your stakeholders by strength of relationship. I like to think about moving stakeholders up a relationship ladder from no relationship to all the way up to willing to take action on our behalf, or even takes action without us asking. As kind of the gold standard here. So for example, if your stakeholders are newly elected members of Congress, then you start having no relationship with them. And then once your team either sends them an email through Outbox or runs into them at an event and logs an interaction, you could reevaluate that relationship strength to knows our team. And then from there, knows our issues, and then supportive of our issues, and then ultimately willing to take action on our behalf. So Quorum is going to help you really visualize and implement on this strategy in our Sheets tool by pulling in columns for example, the strength of relationship here and having the team member assigned here. But I actually want to show you how you can sort of add some columns to this interaction, to this sheet, to see whether or not they are supportive of your issues or they actually are having a strong relationship. So if I click this add new column button here, this is how you can start to add columns to your sheets. So the first step is to add, choose what type of column you'd like. So let's say we want to add in the number of meetings that they've had with our team and the number of days it's been since we logged an interaction with them. So we're going to choose the column type as notes and interactions. And then we can choose, for example, the number of notes and interactions with the office. So this is going to include for officials, both the legislator themselves, as well as any meetings with staffers, which could be helpful. And then the number of days inactive with that office as well. So the number of days it's been since we were in that office. And if I submit these two columns, then they'll be added in and auto updated for each of the officials on our sheet here. So this can be a really helpful way to start to map your stakeholders and understand if they are truly supportive of your issues, or if they truly know our team, how long has it been since we met with them? Maybe you want to establish a protocol that says, they don't know your team unless you've met with them in the last year. And so we could set up some alerts for you, and you could set these up yourself as well to understand really who is meeting the mold of, what does the mold look like for a certain relationship strength. You can also pull in information about their social media dialogue to these sheets as well. So if we wanted to see, I have a client that uses this really effectively to see, anytime someone takes action on their behalf, the way they define that is they tweet one of a series of search terms or keywords that are kind of being put out by their team. So if they use a hashtag that your organization has been promoting, or they talk about a really nuanced issue that you are trying to drive people to talk about, then you can say they are taking action on your behalf if that dialogue is coming into this sheet here. So I want to take a pause here. All this functionality that we've been looking at, if you're following along from home, is under our Sheets tool. So this is kind of where all the data in Quorum comes together. And if you haven't explored it, I definitely encourage you to set up a meeting with your CSM to try to build some sheets, especially if you're using spreadsheets for some of this stakeholder mapping work. But just to create a sheet really quickly, the first step is to choose what type of data should be in here. So we've been using the examples of officials, but if you're really more interested in mapping your relationships with staffers or with contacts, you could create those sheets that way. And then you want to choose which selection of contacts, officials, or staffers should appear in this sheet. So we've been looking at just US senators, but if you wanted to set up a sheet that is specifically sheets or contacts that are tagged as champions or champion, neutral, or detractors, and you want to see those all in one sheet, then you can create those really easily, and they're going to stay up to date as your team makes changes to the data in the system. Great. So now that we've covered some of the example strategies that you can implement, I want to talk through some of the best practices that we would recommend, so you don't have to start from scratch here. Once you map all of your stakeholders, you're now going to have a clear map of where you should spend your time based on your goals. So if your goal is to grow your list of top tier stakeholders, then focus on the folks in the middle. If your goal is to decrease the number of detractors, then you can engage more or differently with those detractors and maybe send different drafts of emails to detractors versus champions. If you're planning a number of initiatives or a webinar series on a particular issue, then focus on those stakeholders who are most interested in that topic, because they're going to be the ones who really engage with you. So this is all kind of aligning your goals to your stakeholder mapping strategy. And then having a map of your stakeholders is also going to allow you to be equally proactive and reactive depending on what the policy landscape looks like. So having your stakeholders mapped means that at any time you can quickly pull a list of your stakeholders who care about a given issue or are most important to your organization. This can be particularly helpful when you're trying to determine who the audience for a particular message should be. If there's a crisis, you need to be able to have your lists ready to go so that you don't get caught flat-footed, and you don't want to be kind of working on mapping your stakeholders in the middle of a crisis, because you need to have that all ready to go. So it's worth investing the time in now, even if things are calm, so that you can kind of move forward effectively. Another benefit of using Quorum specifically to map your stakeholders is that the spreadsheets tool that we have been looking at is going to be auto-updating and auto-populating. So the information in the sheet will always be most up-to-date. So as your team logs an interaction with an official, for example, the number of interactions column will automatically increase to take account of the note that was just logged in Quorum. I talk to a lot of clients, especially as they're starting out, are coming from using these spreadsheets, and no one really knows who has the most up-to-date version of that spreadsheet. And if you are living in that world right now, you should definitely feel free to reach out to your stakeholder, the CSM or your CSM in Quorum, to make sure you can get some of these built out. A couple of other things to highlight in terms of best practices. As you think about what you want to measure over the course of a year, you can pull in fields at the beginning of 2020 and then pull that same exact field at the end of 2020 and see how things change. You could do the same thing at the beginning of Congress, at the end of Congress, or beginning of state sessions, at the end of state sessions. And then survey your team to compare where someone started versus where they ended. Pulling one of these sheets up in a team meeting and just spending 30 minutes to go through and saying, how has this person moved, and marking that right in Quorum so it doesn't have to be a time-intensive effort. Additionally, you can subsequently do a deep dive to see what kind of engagement efforts are proven most valuable and most helpful at logging or at moving the needle on those different stakeholder relationships. So, for example, was it a conference that we had that led to a lot of relationships being deepened, or a lot of people moving from kind of being supportive of our issues to willing to take action on our behalf? Or is it just sending regular email communications that kind of is most effective for your audience? And it's going to be different for each of you. And then the last thing that I would say is just set a standard for your team's tracking so that data is clean and consistent. My most successful clients are coming to us with a very strong mandate from kind of the head of office to say, all meetings that you're taking with stakeholders should be logged in Quorum, and all of your stakeholders should be mapped on these 3 criteria: the tier, the sentiment, and the significance to our organization or the view of our brand. And then if you set that really clear directive, then there's no ambiguity about, well, team member A defines tier 1 as this, and team member B defines tier 1 versus tier 2 as that. So this is all really not easy to do unless you've got a centralized system like Quorum. And then, just as I've mentioned a couple of times, definitely feel free to use the resources of our customer success team. We've built out a lot of great resources in our help center guide, as well as best practices and case studies from other clients who are leveraging the stakeholder mapping functionality in Quorum effectively. And you should definitely also feel free to reach out to your CSM and schedule a training to kind of figure out what these maps should look like. So that is all I wanted to get to. We've got a few minutes here, and I'd love to see if there are any questions in the chat here. Robert, just quick answer for you. This is being recorded, and we can definitely make sure to send it out after the fact. And those sheets that we included on the presentation are all linked to a public version of these spreadsheets so that you can access this on your own end and kind of use this as a guide maybe as you're working in Quorum. Yes, Justin, looks like you raised your hand. So the question from Myra about, this seems like something that a lobbyist would do for your organization. That's a good question. A lot of clients will do this internally and then maybe share out a readout with their lobbyist, or create a bulk upload template. Essentially take your sheet and include it in the or send it over to your lobbyist and have them fill it out and upload it into Quorum. So that is great. Another question in the chat, I might have missed this, but do members need to be tagged to an issue in order to be able to pull the number of interactions on an issue in a sheet? Depends how you pull it. Yes, the best answer would be to see, the interactions should be tagged to the issues. The members do not have to be tagged to the issues. A lot of my clients will make sure to tag every single meeting that they log to an issue, and then be able to pull in a column for just the meetings on a particular issue for that particular member. Hope that answers your question. Another good question from the chat here. We use a combination of elected officials and contacts. One, can we create a sheet based off of both categories? And two, is it recommended or not recommended to do so? So this is a very good question. It's something that we have spent a lot of time thinking about here at Quorum, and a lot of organizations deal with. Is the reality is that whereas Quorum makes the distinction between officials and contacts, you might not make that same distinction and you just call them all stakeholders. What makes this a technical challenge is that in Quorum, officials are pre-populated in the system. So they are going to be uploaded by our team, and after an election, they're going to be updated, with their new committee assignments and their new contact information. Whereas contacts are uploaded by you, and there might be some contacts that you upload that are technically government employees, but are out of the scope of our officials data set. So some kind of lower level agency officials or state agency officials might not be in Quorum, and they would be in the contacts data set. So up to you how you want to handle that. The best practice that I've seen is to really make sure that you replicate your custom fields for tier or sentiment on each of the data sets so that it's the same options for everyone, so that you've got the ability to pull kind of two versions of the same sheet, one that is all of our contacts as rows with columns for tier, sentiment, and issue tag, and then one sheet that is all of our officials with columns for tier, sentiment, and issue tag. And then if you want to report on that, you can always download those out of Quorum into Excel and just delete the header and combine them into one document. But really good question. All right. Looks like we are at time, so I've got to give up the room, but it's been wonderful talking to you, and hope that you all are moving forward and starting to map your contacts and officials. This is great. Have a good one. Thanks, Stevie.